Good morning. It's a pleasure to welcome you here today, whether you're here in person, watching online via Zoom, YouTube, or C-SPAN. Thank you for tuning in. Thanks as well to our event partners, the Asia Society Policy Institute and the Ronald Reagan Building and International Trade Center. I'm Ken Levinson, the Executive Director of WITA. We like to say that at WITA we put the community in trade community, and it's no more true than we can bring so many of you together in Washington, D.C., across the United States, and around the world. Ambassador Tai, it's a pleasure to welcome you once again to WITA. You may not realize it, but you were part of our last in-person pre-pandemic event when we hosted you with current WTO Deputy Director General Angela Ellard, your deputy, Ambassador Jamie White, and our good friend Nassim Fussell. Since that event in February 2020, we've hosted over 120 different webinar panels with almost 25,000 viewers in 49 states and 100 different countries. As we do at a lot of our online events, we like to call out the names of some of those you're in community with, even if you can't see them on Zoom or on C-SPAN today. Welcome today to Mary Thornton at Amazon Web Services, Nelson Cunningham and Kelly Myman with McLarty Associates, Nicole Bivens-Collinson at STR Law, and Nova Daly at Wiley Ryan. Welcome Mary, Nelson, Nicole, Nova, and welcome to all of you. If you're watching this on Zoom, we'll try to get to a few of the questions you ask online when we get towards the end of our panel. We'll try to incorporate some of those along with questions from our audience here. We'll dispense with lengthy introductions of our guests who need no introduction, starting with my good friend and frequent partner at WITA's online events these past 2 years, Wendy Cutler, Vice President of the Asia Society Policy Institute. Wendy, thank you for joining us here again today. And Ambassador Katherine Tai, it's a real honor to welcome you back to the WITA stage. I remember the first time you were with us in 2018, we were joking about the debut of Stranger Things, and we're now in the 4th season of Stranger Things, and more to talk about in the Upside Down. Welcome back, Katherine, and thank you all for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Ken. It's great to be back here, and it's great to be in person, having done so many Zoom events with Ken and with the Washington, D.C. and international and around the country trade audience. Thrilled to be here today with Ambassador Tai, my long-term colleague and friend, now the USTR. I had to look up when you were confirmed, and apparently it was just about 15 months ago. For me, it seems like years. For you, maybe it seems like decades. But when you look back on those 15 months, what has surprised you the most, both in the positive sense, but also maybe in the negative sense? And how, what thoughts do you want to share with the audience about the past 15 months?
Sure. Let me just check and see.
Let's turn it on. Yeah.
I watched you turn it on and thought, that's a good idea. There we go. There you go. So you said 15 months, and I was going to say it was about 7 or 8 pounds ago also. But that says a little bit about what it's like. Wendy, it strikes me every day what an honor and a privilege it is to serve and in this capacity. Especially at a time when there's so much going on. And so much happening that we didn't necessarily anticipate. So to Ken's point about being part of the last in-person event here at WITA, I think that was at the end of February 2020, and we were just 2 weeks away at that point from a 2-year lockdown and rolling pandemic-related restrictions and just an incredibly disrupted period of work and life for all of us. And then more recently, I think that there are folks who are on the foreign policy side and on the intel community side who might have seen this coming more, but I think many of us were really surprised by Russia's decision and President Putin's decision to actually cross over into Ukraine and start an invasion. And since then, I think that, there are just tremendous challenges that we are facing in the global economy. So over the course of this period of time, though, I think as hard as it is on all of us, and as hard as it is to plan in our personal lives, but also professionally for our workers and our businesses, I think that we've demonstrated a real can-do spirit in terms of traveling the world, connecting and reconnecting with our partners, rebuilding and building back even better a lot of our international relationships. And just highlight, if I go back, we have just launched, the president did it in Tokyo, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. We, last year, spent a lot of time on the US-EU relationship. We just had our second Trade and Technology Council meeting. Over the course of last year, we settled the large civil aircraft Boeing Airbus dispute and found a new accommodation with the Europeans on 232 steel and aluminum trade, where we've made some accommodations for each other, but we are working on forward-looking frameworks with the Europeans on both large civil aircraft and in terms of steel and aluminum trade around fair trade and sustainable trade too. So there is a lot going on. Over the course of this year, I think as we've come out of that initial Omicron quiet at the beginning of this year, I think for all of us, Wendy, I've seen you have really hit the road also. Just the travel has ramped back up, and I feel like we cannot get enough of seeing each other and making up for some lost one-on-one, face-to-face time.
Well, you already mentioned the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, so let's delve into that a bit. First of all, kudos to you and the Biden administration for getting so many countries to sign on to it. I think a lot of us did not expect that. And now with Fiji joining, if my math is correct, there are 13 participants. So congratulations on that. But there's no rest for the weary. And now, in many respects, the hard work begins. So can you just, from a procedural point of view, give us a sense of what are the next steps? We've heard about there needs to be a scoping exercise, and then there may be a ministerial, and then the negotiations may begin. Mm-hmm. But maybe you can elaborate more.
Certainly. Well, we've got interest from, as you say, 13 Indo-Pacific partners, and it is a lot. And I think that, you might be surprised if you listen to a lot of the naysayers and skeptics at the beginning saying, well, we don't really know what this is, how interested are people going to be? I think, frankly, basically, when the United States shows up and demonstrates leadership and a vision and a desire to engage, that there is interest and that it will be reciprocated. So in these next weeks and a couple months, I do expect that we will go through an exercise where, as everyone knows, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework is not a traditional free trade agreement negotiation. We are reflecting a Biden administration approach, which is to bring a more holistic economic engagement in which trade is an important part, but not the only part. So there are 4 pillars in addition to trade. There's one on infrastructure and decarbonization, one on supply chains, and also one on tax and anti-corruption. In terms of the signing up and being a part of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework launch, as a partner country, you just need to know that you are interested in fully participating in at least one of these pillars. So over the course of the next couple weeks, what we will be doing is doing deeper dives, answering questions, putting out more details to our vision, collaborating. The collaboration is a very, very important part of this, listening to our partners. I am hopeful that by the summer, we will have a more formalized convening and be able to just, kick off in the different pillars and let the conversations go at their own pace. Secretary Raimondo and I both are in complete agreement that this framework needs to be holistic, needs to be flexible, adaptable, and then really, really pragmatic. So we need to be able to be delivering along the way, as opposed to holding everything together until everything comes together at the end. It really is about, taking issues as we see convergence and then, delivering as we go along.
When you talk about convening at some point to kind of launch the negotiations with pillars, would that be a convening of trade ministers?
I think for the trade piece, certainly, And I think that, when we're looking at the full panoply of the 4 pillars, one of the really interesting aspects of this work is the degree to which, and this is in some ways really by design, the degree to which it forces us in our different traditional silos within the administration to stretch ourselves and to go more cross-disciplinary. So I think it will depend on how the individual governments are organized and structured and agreements within, but certainly on the trade pillar, I would expect to see my usual trade counterparts there.
So, Katherine, you mentioned this idea of kind of early harvest and not necessarily, like in trade talk, the single undertaking, a year, 2 years later. Secretary Raimondo has talked about maybe in the supply chain area, there's some urgency to get things moving there, and if there were early agreements, then they could be announced and implemented. When you look at the trade side, what issues strike you as potential candidates for early harvest? And in that vein, I'd ask you, how about the digital work? Because there seems to be a lot of urgency there, and frankly, a lot of groundwork has been laid in that area.
Well, I don't want to prejudge or put my thumb on the scale before we have brought our trading partners to the table and heard from them. So a lot of it will depend on where everybody is and how ready everyone, and frankly, how much on the same page we already are. You're only going to know that by getting together and comparing notes and bringing your ideas to the table. On digital, what I would say is that yes, I think there is urgency because if you just look at the way we work and we live, so much of our lives, not to mention our economy, right, is taking place on digital platforms through digital means. And we don't have a lot of structure from a regulatory policy standpoint relative to our more traditional aspects of our economies here, and certainly in terms of international collaboration, rulemaking, et cetera, there's less architecture here. On this, what I would say is the conversation is absolutely urgent. The engagement to look at how can we work together to make our digital economies trustworthy, part of a confidence building exercise in terms of rebuilding confidence in the global economic system. And then also, how can we make this digital economy demonstrate that it can serve the interests of a more holistic approach as we are thinking about our economies being constituted of businesses, small and large, promoting competition, and then also, being an important medium through which our workers are engaging, are working, and are interacting with our economy. So this is just a long way of saying I completely agree that this work is so important, but let's see what happens when we bring everybody together.
How about enforcement and the IPEF? It's not a traditional trade agreement. I've seen comments from you and your staff that maybe we shouldn't expect a traditional dispute settlement mechanism, but other creative thinking is being given to this. And in that vein, I've heard this term of maybe including a corporate accountability element into the IPEF. What does that mean?
Sure. Look, I think that traditional mechanisms still do have their place. We're not going to invent the IPEF out of whole cloth. So what still makes sense, we will work from there. I think that part of the challenge for folks to wrap their minds around is if you're not doing tariff reductions, usually a traditional dispute settlement mechanism at the very end of it. If you lose a case, if you on the winning side, if you win a case, the right that you win is to suspend your concessions. At the WTO, that often means, you get to suspend your tariff concessions and you can lay down some tariffs. I think over the course of this negotiation, there will be concessions, there will be commitments that we make to each other. Those also, if they make sense, can be suspended through a traditional dispute settlement mechanism. Let's think that through and design something that makes sense. But I did want to raise awareness around some of the ways in which our U.S. trade practices is already pushing the envelope on the disputes system as it's traditionally been framed. And it really goes to just the fundamental issue of what is the point of a dispute settlement mechanism? Well, you could think about it as it's a forum for us to fight each other, but ultimately when you take it to what the point of an agreement is, it's a way to ensure that what's been negotiated has meaning. That you can't just promise something, say that you are going to do something, and then go do something completely different. It's an accountability mechanism. And if we look at our trade practice, starting with the Peru Free Trade Agreement, which has this very built out, very detailed logging annex that's tailored to the deforestation concerns in Peru when we passed that agreement, to the USMCA's rapid response mechanism, which is looking at creating a mechanism for ensuring compliance with Mexico's labor reform and labor laws. You see this evolution of our dispute settlement mechanism that goes into more cooperative modes and is looking at holding accountable not just the other country, but also what is happening within the economic ecosystem and whether or not the participants, whether they are logging companies or facilities that have set up operations or are operating in Mexico, that they also are abiding by the requirements of and the expectations of the agreement itself. So again, just highlighting that in our own practice, we have started to evolve away from a traditional dispute settlement mechanism to thinking about new ways of holding the different participants in a trade agreement accountable for creating integrity in the promises that are made and in the vision that's incorporated into the agreement.
Typically, one way to hold someone accountable is to basically have penalties in mind if they don't live up to their obligations, commitments. Are you thinking about that with respect to corporate accountability?
I think perhaps if you look at some of the examples that I've given in the logging case and in the rapid response in Peru and the rapid response case in Mexico, there are penalties and there are consequences for non-compliance with the laws of our partner countries, non-compliance with the parameters of the agreement itself. So yes, certainly, but I think that on a broader scale also. What we are looking to do with this kind of next generation of trade engagement and trade arrangements is also to be looking at the incentive structure and to try to create a set of incentives that are powerful enough that you create incentives both through sticks but also with carrots. And I think that just in terms of taking the pulse and the temperature of participants in the global economy, I think that there is a really strong desire to bring back that sense of confidence that the global economy works like clockwork, which is a sense of confidence that I think that we used to have, but we need to adapt to the experiences that we've had, whether it's with the pandemic, whether it's with a war on the European continent, to figure out how we bring that confidence back. And I think that a large part of that is building into our trade relationships, conversations, and then mechanisms for creating resilience. I think it is when we can accomplish buy-in, that we are building a more resilient global economic system, that confidence will start to come back. And around that confidence, I think we also need to see more sustainability built in. The degree to which I hear economic participants, some of our most traditional corporate stakeholders talking about looking at the vision for where the world economy is going and the need to make sure that there is a runway for continuing to operate and to be able to be productive and to be able to provide services and goods for this world. That sustainability piece is also really critical.
So when you mention incentives, at least for a lot of our foreign trading partners, guess what? They think of tariff cuts right away. Mm-hmm. My understanding is the administration has basically taken tariff cuts off the table in this initiative. However, and I did go back this morning and I looked at USTR's Federal Register notice when they invited public comment for this process, there was an interesting phrase, and in the Federal Register notice it said, tariff cuts, basically we're not envisioning tariff cuts or addressing tariff cuts at this time. The words "at this time," at least to me, suggest, as a former government worker, that was probably a negotiated sentence. And maybe there's some folks in the administration that are thinking that maybe at some point we would think about tariff cuts. Is that a fair interpretation? I'm looking at your face. I think I'm gonna get a no, but.
I don't know. I think it's just a fact. We do not have tariff cuts on the table at this time. And I think that, there are a number of reasons for that, but part of it also is a trade practice over the last 20, 30 years that has really, really focused on tariff cuts has brought us to a point where, I think the average bound MFN rate for the United States is quite low. It's around 2%, right?
2.3%.
2.3, but a little bit over 2%. Yeah. So there's not a whole lot for us to further give, right? And I think that the other piece of it is, if the program for chasing liberalization through tariffs has nevertheless demonstrated that what we've got right now is a world economic system that is extremely vulnerable to supply chain disruptions, breakages, bottlenecks. Let's think about promoting the goal of resilience and sustainability. And if there are tools that can do that, let's entertain those tools. But let's think through a little bit what it is that we are trying to accomplish. And for the moment, we have taken the tariff cuts off the table so that we can look at what other tools we have, what other tools we have that we can use in new ways, and frankly, what other tools we can develop. And the digital realm in particular, I think that no one is that focused on tariff cuts as it is, and that kind of next generation conversation is one that is tremendously important and one that also needs to be promoting resilience and sustainability.
Let's change gears a bit. Taiwan, not a member of IPEF, but I think it was just a week ago you announced a new initiative with Taiwan to work on 21st century issues. When I looked at that list of issues, and then I looked at the list of issues that are being addressed in the TIFA that you've reinvigorated at a senior level with Taiwan, there seems to be a lot of overlap. So can you explain to us what's the difference between our TIFA work with Taiwan and this new initiative that's just been unveiled?
Well, I think that, you can think of it as being on a spectrum. I don't know that it necessarily needs to be distinct from each other. One of the really interesting aspects of coming in as U.S. trade representative and then just, carrying President Biden's instruction for America to be back and to rebuild or build up further our relationships with our trading partners has been looking at, well, what kinds of relationships do we already have? And obviously we have FTAs with a number of countries. You will probably know the exact number.
17 is in my head.
All right. I was thinking around 20. That's right. And then, you look at the number of TIFAs that we have, and I think that the number there is 42. It sticks in my mind from my briefings back at home at USTR. There is a whole TIFA practice. We don't just do TIFAs with anyone. There's already been a filtering system in terms of looking at our economic relationship, our strategic relationship, and I think that TIFAs are kind of an overlooked asset. Whatever the platform is, whatever the engagement is that we have created with our trading partners should be the basis for us to build on. And in Taiwan's case, I saw my counterpart, Minister Deng, at the APEC Trade Ministers meeting in May in Bangkok. And we came out of that meeting, it was a very, very good meeting, and we committed that our teams should work together to deepen and expand our trading relationship. And you've seen that just in the last week, we've announced this 21st Century Trade Initiative. We will continue to pursue the trade engagements that make sense as tailored to our different trading partners. And I think that, for us, it's all about substance, the consistency of our vision, and the format will depend on the particular relationship, the history of that relationship that we have.
Okay, now moving around the globe, let's just hit China quickly.
Hit the topic of China quickly.
I'm sorry, of course. We'll touch upon China.
Okay.
Just yesterday in the news, Secretary Raimondo now has joined Secretary Yellen and others in the administration, calling into question whether some of the tariffs we have in place against China are really worthwhile and useful at this point. Many in this room, we've been hearing about an impending Section 301 announcement. We're also hearing about pressure on the administration to reimpose an exclusion process. Secretary Blinken has now given the speech with kind of giving our overall China policy, putting that forward, which in my mind always meant then we would start hearing other pieces of the puzzle. So are we going to be hearing more on China trade in the next week or two?
Look, I think that the issue of the U.S.-China trade relationship is one of the most important ones, and I feel confident that everyone who is in this room with us and everyone who is with us virtually works on this issue in some way or another, or their work is impacted by this issue. So look, I think that what is really important for the Biden administration is to bring a thoughtful, strategic, deliberate approach to how we manage this relationship overall. As you saw in Secretary Blinken's speech, it was a long speech. And that looked at the entire relationship and covered a lot of ground. I think that no matter what, we will be talking and thinking about China for years to come. And in terms of timelines, I think that just as everyone here is always, I think, my guess is, working on thinking about the U.S.-China trade relationship, the challenges that we have, but also real opportunities that we need to be thinking about too. So are we thinking about this in the administration, and I think that is reflective of one of the most important responsibilities we have right now, which is to figure out how to get this relationship right, and nothing about this relationship is easy.
Well, I think we'll all agree with that last sentence. Nothing is easy. Maybe we can then move on to your travel schedule. So the next 10 days, you're going to be in
a number of different places.
Yeah.
I will be in Los Angeles for the Summit of the Americas. The OECD is convening trade ministers later this week in Paris, and then MC12 kicks off, knock on wood, on Sunday the 12th. No, it's a really important time. There are a lot of things that we need to accomplish, and a lot of, in ways, a lot of lost time or lost engagement to make up for.
What's your mood going into the WTO ministerial? This ministerial, in some ways, seems jinxed, and it's been postponed 3 times. And if things weren't complex enough, there's now a war between 2 WTO members. And the issues are tough.
Yes.
And some of them are, frankly, getting a little boring as well, like fish subsidies. So my question to you, how are you feeling going into the meeting, and how would you define success? I mean, some people are saying success is just the fact that the WTO is meeting in such a, a difficult period in our history.
Well, look, I'm really looking forward to MC12, and precisely because, and I wouldn't say because it's been jinxed, but I take your point. This is the 4th time that we've tried to convene for MC12, but I think that's why I'm so energized. And we were all ready actually to get on planes, and I know that there were some of my counterparts who were already in Geneva when
some
it
of
was
your
called
delegation,
off. And some of my delegation were already there, and some got called back, in mid-flight or at their transfer points. It really did happen right before MC12 was supposed to start last fall. It looks like it's actually going to happen, right? There are a lot of conversations, important ones that we need to advance. Whether or not we can get them across the finish line, I don't know. Truly, I don't know. And if I did, trade would be a lot less interesting and a lot easier than it actually is. But it is really important for us to have MC12. And then it is really important for us to wake up the day after MC12 and feel like we have a vision for what we would like MC13 to be. I'll also say that I am even more energized going into this MC12 in June of 2022 than I was feeling last fall, in large part because we now have our WTO ambassador in place, Maria Pagan. We now have our assistant USTR for our WAMA office in place, Andrea Durkin. David Bisbee, who had been wearing lots of different hats in Geneva, now has as ambassador and has the institutional knowledge for where all the conversations have been. I feel really confident about the team that USTR is bringing to this, and I feel confident that we will make the very best of challenging circumstances, and we are looking at how we position ourselves coming out of MC12 with a vision for being long-term committed to the WTO, but also knowing that there's a very important reform conversation and process that awaits us on the other side.
And just to say, I was in Geneva a couple of weeks ago, and you've put together a strong team, and I think folks are noticing that in Geneva, which is extremely important. But just back to some of the deliverables, maybe you can share with us your thoughts on the TRIPS waiver. There is a text out there. Some differences have been narrowed. China, at least, has publicly announced that it does not intend to avail itself to the TRIPS waiver, which I view as a step forward. Do you see any opening in that China announcement, if it were indeed memorialized in writing, that could help pave the way for an agreement on the TRIPS waiver?
I think one of the key aspects of China as a trade partner and in some of these forums too is obviously as the second largest economy in the world, when China speaks, people listen, right? This is a relationship that has been very important to us for many, many years. There's a real question around, well, when China speaks, what is it saying? And how good is China for the words that it says? Or frankly, even the words that it signs up to on paper. I think that going into MC12, I am also interested in seeing who does China send to Geneva? Whether they do send someone.
Meaning a trade minister?
A trade minister,
or
someone
vice
responsible
minister.
from Beijing.
Yeah.
They do have a very capable WTO ambassador who I know and who I really respect from my days as a WTO litigator. I think one of the things that Dr. Ngozi has called for is around MC12 and more consistently, she would like to see the active participation of ministers. And she has said that, when you let things go on autopilot in Geneva, not a lot happens. And we are at a point where things need to start happening. I'll be interested to see how that proceeds because the WTO is about its members. What happens at MC12 will depend on what teams show up and what kinds of commitment they bring.
Yeah. Another important member for the WTO ministerial success is India. And they don't have a great track record in bringing success to ministerials. And when I was in Geneva, I heard a concern, again, that maybe India would somehow block some of this work. I know you have a really good relationship with the new Indian trade minister. Have you been in touch with him in the lead up to the ministerial to try and work together to make this ministerial a success?
So I've been in very good touch with Minister Goyal, and last fall, as part of my first tour of Asia, I went to Tokyo, Seoul, and then Delhi.
For the Trade Policy Forum.
This is for the Trade Policy Forum, and it was the first time in 5 years. And we felt it was very important to put out a joint statement there. And we didn't just put out a joint statement. That joint statement was 5 or 6 pages. It was a really robust joint statement. So we are working very hard on making our trade relationship with India effective and productive. Now, India knows its own mind. India has a complex place in the world order, to put it diplomatically, in terms of India's approach to trade and to the WTO, what I see is an increasingly strategic India when it comes to trade. And so I am confident that India will be engaging with intentionality. It is a complicated world, and I think Russia's invasion of Ukraine has actually made our trade interactions at these large forums that much more complex. But again, with respect to all of our trading partners, I think that there is a commitment that we will see demonstrated or not at MC12.
You've mentioned, I've heard others talk about, we should think post MC12 and particularly about the reform discussion going forward. For a lot of countries, when they talk about reform, they're really focused on fixing the dispute settlement system as a first step. And it seems to me that this is an area where the US has been under a lot of criticism, but perhaps in recent months there has been a change in tone, and countries are beginning to sense that we are interested in fixing the system. Now, you are a USTR litigator. You know the value of the system, but you know the ugly parts too very well. So how are you approaching dispute settlement? Are you going to give your team kind of the leeway to explore solutions and a way to fix the dispute settlement system?
I love this question, Wendy, because obviously you're no stranger to the WTO or the dispute settlement system either, and you're no stranger to the conversations, and I absolutely agree with you that the conversations from when I started at USTR to today in these 15 months has really evolved. I would go a step further and say that when I started, a lot of the focus on WTO reform was not about fixing the dispute settlement system or addressing it. It was about, quote, restoring the appellate body, which is a very, very narrow way of approaching this particular issue. And I think we've been quite successful in orienting people to the fact that the appellate body problem is a symptom of a larger challenge that we have, and it is around the dispute settlement system and whether or not it is doing the thing that it was designed to do, which is literally to help settle disputes between the members at the WTO. And I gave a speech in Geneva last October where I talked about, first, reaffirm the Biden administration's commitment to the WTO, and then to go through some of the areas of reform that we think really need robust engagement from the WTO membership. At the top is the dispute settlement system. I think that over time it has become this very, very unwieldy and expensive mechanism for litigation that not all WTO members can access. There's actually a very high threshold to accessing the system. And if you think about it, how effective is a dispute settlement system that only a small part of the membership feels like it can use? And then that's without even going into, right, the ins and outs of how that litigation system works. So over time, dispute settlement has kind of become synonymous with litigation. That's a challenge, that's a problem, especially because we also have this issue where the last really multilateral agreement that came out of the WTO was accomplished in 2013. It was the Trade Facilitation Agreement, which, if you get into the ins and outs of the TFA, is a no-brainer. It really is something that is good for the system and is about, upgrading to reflect the realities of today's trade in goods. And yet that required a small miracle. And I think, the personal charm and relationships that Ambassador Michael Punk had built up in Geneva. So if you look at it that way, the negotiation function at the WTO is also significantly broken down. And I am interested to engage at MC12 to see, as of 2022, has it started to heal itself in a time of great global economic need? Are we able to come together, or is the system still going to be stymied by all of the dynamics that we've seen? And I think that the reason why I raise this is because the ability of WTO members to obtain findings through litigation that effectively create rules that did not need to go through the negotiation process is part of the significant challenge that the WTO has as an institution. And I think that that larger issue needs to be surfaced and dealt with if we truly are committed to the WTO. And so to get to your specific question, yes, absolutely. I have asked my team to engage on dispute settlement as part of this larger vision for reinvigorating the WTO.
So in terms of negotiation, then, how do you view the fish subsidies negotiations? Some people say it's almost a litmus test for the WTO's negotiating function. If the fish subsidies talks, which have been underway for over 20 years, can't reach a successful conclusion, what hope is there when we think of more complex issues that need to be negotiated?
I guess, litmus tests are not that helpful, especially when you're dealing with an organization like the WTO, which is so right, multi-layered. But I think that it will be an important data point. And I think from our perspective, as we're approaching MC12 and the engagement around fish subsidies, it is going to be about whether or not over the course of 20 years, in a world situation where fish stocks are being further and further deteriorated, that whether or not the WTO can come together to create real disciplines with a sustainable development goal in mind. I think that no matter what happens, it is going to be important for us to think through the parameters for the reform exercise.
Another issue that's come to the forefront for the ministerial is the fate of the customs moratorium. And I think there's a real concern among many in the U.S. business community that this may not be extended. Are you worried?
Am I worried? Let me say this. Yes, I'm worried, but then I'm worried. I'm just generally worried, right? But again, let me channel my initial answer to your question about how I'm thinking about MC12, how I feel about it. I am energized. This is our time to come together and figure out what we can do, including on the customs moratorium. I think on this issue, the moratorium has been around for a long time now. The justifications for the moratorium have evolved. We need to be having a conversation about the moratorium that reflects the state of our economy now, and we need to be engaging with the partners, including the ones who want to see it gone, around what their interests are and what their strategy is for engaging on this issue. So I'll just say I am energized to engage on this in MC12 because it's important.
Fit in one more question, because we haven't discussed the Summit of the Americas.
Yep.
And I know Ken, that was on my list, and I promised Ken I'd raise it. So you're leaving tomorrow for LA, but apparently you'll then be going on to Paris before the actual summit begins. So what will you be doing in Los Angeles? You'll be meeting with trade ministers on the side and also engaging stakeholders?
I'll be having a number of bilats while I'm in LA.
Will you be discussing the ministerial, the WTO?
We'll be discussing everything. I mean, in terms of those bilats, and this is something that I've really missed because of a lot of the virtual convenings around these types of summits and forums. Is how the bilaterals go, right? There's sort of the big, large multilateral agendas that you want to make sure you coordinate on. But fundamental to the bilateral engagement is the bilateral relationship. And so there are a number of, there's some new counterparts who have just come into their positions who I haven't had a chance to meet yet. I'm really looking forward to making those connections. Latin America is the one region, I think, where we have the most FTAs. And it is also a really diverse region. I am really looking forward to engaging with these partners at the summit and then building on this engagement over into MC12.
Will you travel to the region by the end of the year or next year?
I'm sure I will. I went down to Mexico last July to celebrate the first anniversary of the USMCA. I'm certain that I will.
Thank you, Ambassador Tai. Thank you, Wendy. So what we're going to do is we're going to try to take some questions in the room. So formulate those. We'll run a microphone over to you. If you do ask a question in the room, ask that you please keep it short so we can actually have the time to listen to Ambassador Tai's response, and put it in the form of a question, and identify who you are. But before we do that, we want to bring on some of our Zoom questions, if I may. We're trying to do this hybrid thing here. So one of the questions comes in about the nexus between Russia sanctions and the seemingly emergent issue of the relationship between national and economic security. And then what does that mean for the WTO?
So Russia sanctions is the intro, national economic security, and what does it mean for the WTO? Well, you know what, I guess I'd push back that this is an emergent issue. I think that national economic security have always been linked. And there are times when that linkage is more accentuated, and there are times when that linkage is less accentuated. I think with respect to China, that convergence of national and economic security have been coming together over the course of the last couple of years quite a bit, and we now see it also with Russia. What does this mean for the WTO? I think that it's all part and parcel of our engagement at the WTO. The WTO is a collection of economies, among those economies, we all go through these changes in our relationships and the dynamics in the global economy. So I see this actually not as an emergent issue, but as something that's really baked into the pie.
Great. Well, thinking of our national security interests, there's also been a lot of discussion about nearshoring and the relationship with our USMCA partners. I don't know how many months now we're into that. I'm not keeping a calendar on that, but how are we doing so far? That's another one of the questions we have coming from our friends online.
Sure, I think it's 23 months because it's July 1 for our entry into force. So we're coming up on the 2-year anniversary of USMCA being in effect. How are we doing? I think, this relationship is strong. I think that going through the exercise of renewing our vows to each other, if you will, addressing some of the, going through some couples therapy also, or, over the course of that process, has been really important. And I think it came at a really important time because none of us could have known it, of course. But having USMCA basically come up through the Congress in 2019, make it through the Senate in early 2020, be signed into be signed into law, and then go into force a couple months into the pandemic. I think that you never know what the counterfactual would be, but I think that the timing was really important in getting us through the pandemic, as challenging as it was and as difficult as it was. A lot of the updates to USMCA made this Canada, US, Mexico relationship, I believe, and at some point, someone will have some time to do an economic analysis, but I strongly believe made this North American relationship more resilient through some very challenging years.
Good morning, Madam Ambassador. I'm Robert Tobias, and I'm with the National Association of Beverage Importers, as in beverage alcohol. First, thank you for your service, and second, thank you for your great work, analytical mantra of walking, chewing gum, and playing chess all at the same time. I found it very useful. Because it's beverage alcohol, obviously the Airbus tariffs and the DST tariffs issues are on the forefront of my members. You have reached settlements, but they are, I've always reminded my members that they're kind of temporary. We feel they will stay in place, but they're still temporary. With the DST, particularly the French DST, your trip to Paris later this week, what are your goals, aspirations, hopes on the movement on the two-pillar international tax framework? movement on that is kind of contingent on whether or not those DSTs may be reimposed investigations. Thank you, Madam Ambassador.
Sure, thank you. Let me just say something about the nature of the accommodations that we've reached with Europe in large civil aircraft, including steel and aluminum, and also the DSTs. I guess one way you could look at it is it's temporary. I think that the way I look at it is we've reached an accommodation, and yet we have kept ourselves and our partners on the hook. That, it isn't just, okay, we're done and we're going to move on. There is a reason why we took each one of those disputes or each one of those situations to the brink and had tariffs in place in order to maintain the free flow of trade between us. We need to hold each other accountable, and we have more work to do, we and the Europeans. I am very confident that we're going to deliver in each one of those areas. On the DST, on this one, I think the easy answer for me to keep things tight is to say the actual negotiations on Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 are taken up by Secretary Yellen and her department. But in this area, obviously, with the DST 301s, we work very, very closely with our Treasury counterparts. And I would tell you that on these issues in particular, for those of us who have been around government, the traditional kind of USTR Treasury tensions are really not present. We have worked hand in glove with Secretary Yellen and her team, and I know that that Pillar 1, Pillar 2 agreement is something that Secretary Yellen takes great pride in. We will have to see. Obviously, in these situations, it's not just up to us, it is up to our partner countries. I remain confident that, especially with our European partners, that we will find a way.
Thank you.
Hi, Ambassador Tai. It's so good to see you. Wendy, thank you for knocking it out of the park and asking most of my questions. Caitlin Signolfi with International Paper. I just wanted to ask, with the focus on climate change around the globe and by the Biden administration, what do you think are the possibilities of EGA being reinvigorated at WTO? Maybe not this ministerial, but maybe the next one?
Thank you, Caitlin. It's great to see you. It's great to see you in person. I have a great interest in reinvigorating the EGA conversation, but in bringing a 2022 consciousness to the EGA negotiations. And I think that one of the most important ways in which that negotiation needs to be updated is to think through how we are harnessing our trade tools, right, to further cleaner, greener investments in trade and a more sustainable world. The traditional approach, which is the one that we had in EGA back in 2014, 15, 16, was one where we were going to knock down tariffs on goods that we considered to be environmental goods. And all of the negotiation was around whether or not a good was environmental or green or not, right? Which created some real conflicts. It's not easy around bicycles, around wind turbines, things like that. Here's the challenge that we have today, which is if you just look at the example of solar panels, right? That is a green good, and solar panels need to be deployed, and they are available technology to be able to allow the world to be more effective in reaching our climate and our carbon goals. But we are 85% reliant on China as a producer of solar panels. And the real challenge we have there is that supply chain runs right through the region of China where we know there's a significant forced labor problem. We also know that a significant part of the Chinese production economy is run on coal-fired power. And so if you're looking at, let's knock down, the tariffs on green goods, but you're not looking at how those goods are produced and whether or not the production of those goods in itself is contributing to sustainability, then I think that you've missed a huge part of the picture. And so my interest is definitely in having this conversation at the WTO to say, if we know that sustainability is something that we all want to contribute to, let's update our thinking around how we contribute to that through the use of trade tools.
Madam Ambassador, Dave Salmonson with American Farm Bureau. At the ministerial conference next week, What is the U.S., along with other members, looking to accomplish to help those countries that have their growing concerns about food security, of course, due to all the disruptions in grain trade because of the conflict in Ukraine?
That's a great question, very much on our minds, and I include in our Secretary Vilsack's mind as well. He and I have been in good touch over some of these concerns around food insecurity around the world. In terms of approaching MC12, and frankly, all of our global engagements, what we would like to do is find ways to partner and to have a conversation around how we can come together to be a part of the solution. Having significant food insecurity around the world, especially in our emerging economies, is not good for them, and it's not good for any of us in a world economic system that already feels quite fragile and brittle. So I think that, writ large, that's how we're thinking, and we have an extremely productive agricultural economy here in the United States. The question is, how can we take our strengths and put our strengths together with others to work out a system that brings back and builds on a sense of security.
Hi, Nicole Vivens-Collinson, Sandler, Travis, and Rosenberg. Good to see you, Madam Ambassador. Hopefully a very easy question. Where is Canada with respect to the IPEF?
Oh, I was going to say, it's to our north, Nicole. It was a geography question. Where is Canada with respect to the IPEF? Well, Canada is one of our most important trading partners, as you know. We actually, and I'm going to throw in the Europeans also, I think that there are a number of our allies and partners who all are very interested in engaging with our Indo-Pacific partners and coming together with them around shared interests and shared challenges. The Europeans, but the Canadians also, are partners with whom we stay in good touch to ensure that our respective approaches to the Indo-Pacific are mutually reinforcing and that we don't, accidentally step on each other. So Canada is an important partner in that effort.
Ambassador Tai, such a pleasure to see you in person. Thank you so much. I'm Ed Bristois, the Vice President of International Trade for the Consumer Technology Association. I'd like to circle back to two topics we talked about, IPEF and the customs duty moratorium for e-commerce. In the IPEF, there are economies that have openly said we'd like to apply customs duties on electronic transmissions and data flows. India has been very explicit about that. There are probably others in the IPEF as well, others in Africa, Indonesia, South Africa. Are you going to be talking to some of these members prior to MC12? And is this on your agenda for your engagements in Paris or in Los Angeles? Thanks.
I just saw Minister Lutfi of Indonesia in Bangkok for the APEC trade ministers, raise this issue with him. Dr. Ngozi did a Zoom appearance at that at APEC. In our ongoing conversations, yes, and as MC12 comes up, we will be more and more focused on the set of issues that come up in MC12. So I guess the short answer to that question is yes.
Well, thank you. We have about a dozen questions that came in on Zoom. I know your time is tight, but I do want to ask one of them, and then we'll wrap up with that and see if Wendy has anything to wrap with. But just it was the question of the economy in general in the U.S., the Biden administration's focus on inflation and the potential nexus between tariffs. Any thoughts on that?
If I said no, would you believe me? Look, not just Americans, but a lot of people around the world are contending with an inflationary environment. It is scary. It creates anxiety. It also inflicts pain on your pocketbook, and it goes to how we engage in the world and how we feel in terms of our economic security. So it is a really important issue. I guess what I would say is this, which is the singular focus on tariffs in the context of inflation. Look, the economy is large, and there are a lot of pressure points and levers in that economy. If we are going to take on an issue like inflation and give it the seriousness that it requires, then our approach to tools for mitigating and addressing that inflation need to respect that it is a more complicated issue than just tariffs at the border.
Very good. Thank you. Wendy, any final thoughts or words?
Just a big thank you and wish you the best of luck, particularly over the next 10 days, but beyond that as well.
Thank you so much, Wendy. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Ken.
Thank you all for joining us. We look forward to hosting you again soon.